There are cities that history forgets, civilizations that rise, flourish, and disappear into the silence of the earth. Their names outlasting their stones only because someone wrote them down. And then there are cities like Sodom, a city so thoroughly destroyed that for thousands of years scholars debated whether it had ever existed at all. A city whose name became a word, a single word that carries the weight of everything that went wrong within its walls. Most people think they know this story. Fire, brimstone, angels, a pillar of salt. A God who looked down at a city and decided it needed to be erased from the earth. But here is the question that the text itself raises, and that most tellings of this story never answer. What exactly had Sodom done that was so irredeemable, so completely beyond repair, that the only response available was total annihilation? Because the answer, when you read the full account, when you read what the prophets say about it, when you look at what the ancient world understood about the moral architecture of the city, is more complicated, more human, and far more uncomfortable than you have probably been told. The story begins not with fire, but with abundance. Genesis describes the plain of Jordan, the land where Sodom and Gomorrah sat, as well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. This is important. Sodom was not a city built in desperate poverty, struggling to survive in a hostile land. It was a city built in prosperity. The land was fertile, the water was plentiful, trade passed through it, wealth accumulated within it. Lot, the nephew of Abraham, chose this land deliberately. When Abraham gave him the choice of any direction, Lot looked toward the cities of the plain and chose them because the land was good. He knew what he was choosing. The cities of the plain were cosmopolitan, wealthy, and well-connected. 5 cities in confederation: Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and Zoar, sitting at what was likely a major intersection of ancient trade routes. These were not remote backwater settlements. They were cities at the center of the world as the ancient world knew it, and they had had every advantage a city could be given, which makes what happened to them all the more significant. Because the question the text is asking is not, what does a city do with its poverty? It is asking, what does a city do with its abundance? Most people who know the story of Sodom know it through the lens of these 2 angels who arrive at the city gate and are threatened by a mob. That scene is real. It is in the text, and it is genuinely disturbing. A city that responds to the arrival of strangers with collective violence, that surrounds a house, that refuses to be reasoned with, that has become so completely unified in its cruelty that even Lot's offer to negotiate cannot find a single crack of decency to work through. But the story of Sodom does not begin with the angels arriving at the gate. It begins much earlier. It begins with a phrase that appears before any of the dramatic events unfold, a phrase so small it is easy to miss. Genesis 13:13. Now the men of Sodom were wicked, great sinners against the Lord. The wickedness preceded the angels. The corruption was already complete before the test arrived. The angels did not come to corrupt Sodom. They came to a city that was already corrupt, and to find out whether there was anything left worth saving. And this is where the story gets genuinely uncomfortable, because the prophets of the Hebrew Bible do not describe Sodom's sin the way most modern readers expect. The prophet Ezekiel, writing centuries after the destruction, gives the most direct description of what Sodom had become. He writes, "This was the guilt of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters had pride, excess of food, and prosperous ease, but did not aid the poor and needy. They were haughty and did abominable things before me. So I removed them when I saw it. Pride, excess of food, prosperous ease, failure to aid the poor and needy, haughtiness." This is a prophet of God describing the primary moral failure of Sodom. And at the top of his list is not the violence of the mob at the city gate, At the top of his list is what a prosperous city did with its prosperity. To understand what Ezekiel is describing, you need to understand something about how the ancient world thought about cities. In the ancient Near East, the moral health of a city was measured not by its wealth, but by what it did with its wealth. The test of a civilization was how it treated the people who had nothing: the stranger at the gate, the widow with no protector, the poor man with no advocate, the traveler who arrived with nowhere to sleep. Hospitality was not a nicety in the ancient world. It was a moral obligation. It was the visible measure of whether a community had organized itself around human dignity or around its own comfort. And Sodom had failed that test completely, not once, not occasionally, but as a matter of culture, so thoroughly that when genuine strangers arrived at the city gate, the instinct of the entire city was not to offer shelter, but to threaten, to dominate, to harm. The mob that gathered outside Lot's house was not an aberration. It was the logical conclusion of a community that had spent generations organizing itself around the principle that the weak exist to serve the strong, and the stranger deserves nothing. The violence of that night was not the cause of Sodom's destruction. It was the symptom of something that had been rotting for a very long time. Before the destruction comes, the text pauses on one of the most extraordinary conversations in all of Scripture. Abraham, who has been told what is about to happen, does something remarkable. He argues with God. He stands before the Lord and says, "What if there are 50 righteous people in the city? Will you destroy the righteous along with the wicked? Far be it from you to do such a thing. Shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just?" This is Abraham, not a prophet delivering a message, a man having an argument with the divine on behalf of people he has never met. And God engages with the argument. If there are 50 righteous people in Sodom, the city will be spared for their sake. Abraham pushes further. What about 45? What about 40? What about 30? What about 20? What about 10? And each time the answer is the same. For the sake of 10 righteous people, I will not destroy it. 10. Abraham stops at 10 because he cannot bring himself to ask the question he already suspects the answer to. What if there are not even 10? The Angi find Lot. They find his family. They do not find 10. In a city of thousands, in a city sitting on fertile land with more than enough for everyone, in a city that had been given every advantage a community can receive. They cannot find 10 people who have chosen to remain decent. As Lot and his family flee, the angels give them a single instruction: do not look back. Most tellings of this story treat Lot's wife turning to look as a moment of disobedience, a woman who could not follow a simple command and paid the ultimate price. But there is another way to read it. Lot's wife grew up in Sodom. She raised her children in Sodom. Her daughters were engaged to men of Sodom. Her entire world, everything she had built, everything she had loved, everything that gave her life its shape and meaning, was Sodom. And she turned back to look at it, not in defiance, in grief. The text does not tell us what was on her face in the moment she became a pillar of salt. But the image it leaves behind, a woman frozen in the act of looking back at everything she could not save, is one of the most human moments in the entire story. She is not the villain of this account. She is the cost of it. The reminder that when civilizations collapse, real people lose real worlds, real families scatter, real lives are unmade. The fire is not abstract. The destruction is not clean. It is total, and it reaches everyone. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah has been used for centuries to make a single, narrow argument about a single category of sin. But the text itself is making a much wider argument. It is asking what happens to a community built on abundance that chooses cruelty over hospitality, that organizes itself around power rather than justice, that grows so comfortable in its prosperity that it loses the capacity for basic human decency toward those who have nothing. It is asking what kind of city you build when you have everything. And it is suggesting, through the story of a fertile plain, a generous patriarch arguing at the edge of destruction, a mob that cannot find mercy, and a woman who turns back to look, that the answer to that question is the most important answer any civilization ever gives. Sodom was not destroyed because it was the worst thing imaginable. It was destroyed because it had been given everything imaginable and had chosen, slowly, quietly, completely, to become the worst thing imaginable anyway. This is Faith Untold.